Well, yeah, there is self, it's not yours. That's it. So the Buddha never said there is no self. He said that which is self is not yours. And there's a big difference. So it's removing the ownership, it will remove the sense of self. People think I own things because I am. No, it's the other way around. It's because you keep taking things as mine through sensuality, aversion, and ignorance. That's why you are. That's why you have generated that sense of self that you cannot step outside of. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of ownership. You remove the ownership, sense of self cannot persist, or not to the same extent. That's why Attavada is a view. See, there is a sense of self as a result of careless ownership, not seeing impermanence, not restraining your actions, and that self that has been generated through such actions, you put first, and that's the Attavada. You think that is the first thing, so I own things because I am. No, it's because you keep owning individual things, that's why you are. That's why that sense of self is there, and that's why the view on top of it is there. So it's not you don't develop the experience of not myself through figuring it out. You develop it through purifying your behavior that has been feeding it and sustaining it. And then you'll see that that sense of self does not belong to you, and thus it cannot be called self truly. That's why when people came to the Buddha and said, so Master Gautama says there is no self. And he would be quiet. He wouldn't even reply to that, because it's a question completely based on that wrong assumption that they don't see. So there is a sense of self then, Master Gautama. No, he wouldn't reply to that either. But practically speaking, that sense of self, that is yours, remove that part of this is mine, and it won't be sense of self anymore. But don't try to remove the whole thing by saying, the self doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, what are you referring to as non-existing? There has to be something that's being designated when people say, there is no self. And that's that whole, the view permutation. With self, he sees self. Or with self, he sees not self. Or with not self, he sees self. But Putujana cannot, with not self, see the not self. It has to be, sense of self has to be either on the immediacy level or on the level of reflection. But if he were to undo the ownership of any kind, through contemplating impermanence, sense restraint, guarding of the sense doors, then he will be able to see not self with the not self. In other words, without owning the sense of self, he can see that self which is there, which won't be self anymore. So the ownership part is what makes it the self, not that thing that is there taken to be the self. Because when the Buddha said, what is it that, Putujana takes as self? It's the form, it's the feeling, it's the perception, it's the intentions and the consciousness. There is nothing. So all the phenomena generally, your sense of self will be resting upon something, because your sense of self will be resting upon the ownership of something.
So, if I understand correctly, if you remove this ownership, you also remove the attachments you have to it, and therefore you would see it more objectively. Is this the difference?
Sort of. It's basically, if you say, you keep eating food that doesn't agree with you, and your whole body is suffering, you're having headaches, and who knows what else, and you don't know the reason. You don't know that it's because of the food. So now you sometimes you have a headache like this, but if you concentrate on something else, headache disappears, then you think maybe but either way, you keep eating the food, that it's making your condition worse. Then you find out that was the problem. You stop eating the food that was bothering you. Sufficient time needs to pass, basically, until the body recovers, and the headache will slowly dissipate and not come back. And that's what will happen to the sense of self. Not that you're going to lose your head that used to hurt. You're just going to lose the pain of that which still remains there. So that sense of self, that sense of an individual that's still making choices, that remains. But the emotional ownership of it, that's gone. And that is an arahant. That's what people cannot think, or either cannot understand or think arahant is this spaced out robot unaware of himself. No, he still makes choices, he still prefers, he still has agreeable and disagreeable. He has no ownership of any of it, top to bottom. And that's why he cannot suffer, because he's not involved with the wrong view.
Would you say that this, so this is something I read in the suttas, I thought it was really nice, but that the sense of self is actually a corruption of the mind. It's a corruption. So the mind without the sense of self, the Buddha says is malleable, wielding, and radiant.
Sure. But see, if somebody is not free from the sense of self, their thought of a mind that's malleable, radiant, is taken as their self. In other words, that's not what that mind is. So then now you are perceiving the idea of not self, mind free from self, with your current self. And that's one of the views that's read out. So you cannot even theoretically understand mind free from the sense of self, free from the ownership, unless you have developed non-ownership here and now.
I received another question very much related to this. So the question goes, if nothing is yours, what is then your mind? If nothing is left, how do you train your mind? Or what do you train your mind with?
What do you mean nothing's left? Everything is left. You haven't touched anything. You just removed your gratuitous emotional ownership of it. You don't need to destroy things to not own them. You just need to stop regarding them as yours mentally.
Because if they're not yours, they're not your problem.
Exactly. Now imagine you have that attitude towards your own senses, towards your own feeling, towards your own intentions, towards your own mind. Imperturbable attitude. In other words, you cannot forget that it cannot be yours even if you want it to be yours. It's important. It's inconceivable. Ownership becomes inconceivable because you thoroughly understood the danger, the peril, the escape, and so on. The impermanence, the unownability of these things. You fully understood, and you don't even need to keep telling to yourself, "Oh, this is not mine." So nothing can disturb you then at all. Absolutely inconceivable. Suffering or any perturbance cannot be even perceived anymore.
Ajahn Chah saying, well, sorry, just this maybe. Ajahn Chah said somewhere, every time, so you have these problems, the phone keeps ringing, and every time the phone rings, you pick it up and say, "Hi, this is Mr. Smith," and he said, "Well, just stop picking up the phone and stop thinking you're Mr. Smith."
Yeah, well, you can't help. You can't stop thinking who you are.
Stop picking up the phone.
Yeah, so it's not a matter of choice, but you can certainly stop owning how Mr. Smith feels and not acting out of the feeling when you pick up the phone. And then even that Mr. Smith will fade away.
So could you, in a certain sense, say, because this act of ownership is interesting, could you say then that maybe one way of putting this would be to say, to realize that the structure of the self, so or the sense of self, is something that is embedded in a larger picture, in a larger process, which is basically selfless. So there's already this sense of the act of ownership, the process of ownership, right? Because there's a slight potential danger here. You might say that, well, where is this sense or process of ownership nested? So who is it that wants to own?
Right.
That's a problem. So in a certain sense, you kind of have to realize that this is a bottomless process, so to speak. It is a process that does not have yet another self underneath it that would like to grasp
Yeah. In that sense, it's beginningless. It's like a vicious circle.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, you have a headache. because of the food you eat, and you keep eating the food because you think it suits your headache. So headache is not a problem, it's a symptom, but at the same time becomes a problem because you keep acting out of it. Stop acting out of it, it's going to be seen as a symptom, and then eventually you're going to discover what the real problem is. You kept thinking that's the problem, and you kept acting out of it, and you kept doing things that were feeding it in return, ironically enough.
In the Buddhist perspective, so the overall general framework, the question as to how and why this came to be is a non-question, so to speak.
Exactly, it's a question of, like when the Buddha said, imagine a man being shot by an arrow.
Yeah.
But instead of allowing that arrow to be pulled out and wound healed, he won't allow it until he finds out who shot him, why they did so, what did he do to deserve that, is there anything that he could have avoided, what clan was the man that he... all of these irrelevant things while he's dying. So you need to realize where the priority is. Getting the arrow out. Doesn't matter who, why, or what shot me. What matters is I'm shot and I'm bleeding out.
Okay, I would have a question. Or did you want to say something?
No, I was just trying to fill the silence with some random ramblings, so thank you.
We just said that we're not supposed to do that.